Hello, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where in the world you are, and welcome to day two of our first ever virtual Resolve. Normally, we'd be getting together for an in-person gala, and this year we're doing our best to take all of the incredibly inspiring conversations that take place during that event and break them up into bite-sized pieces that you can get a hold of over the course of this week. And so we kicked things off with a panel yesterday on COVID response and how social enterprise has been a solution for that. And today's panel will be discussing social justice and inequality in 2020. My name is George Tsiadis, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of the Resolution Project, and I'm thrilled to welcome you here. Our panelists today, all Resolution Fellows, will discuss what role young people can play to create a more just, fair, and equal world in the next decade. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsor for today's panel, White and Case, as well as the panelists and moderator for sharing their expertise with us all. I encourage you to leave comments for the panelists in the chat section, and they will do their best to respond live, time permitting. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jasmine Mitchell. Jasmine holds a PhD in American Studies from the University of Minnesota and a BA in American Studies from Williams College. Born in Philadelphia and raised in Brooklyn, Jasmine currently lives in Manhattan. She's an assistant professor of American Studies and Media Studies at the State University of New York, Old Westbury. Her scholarly specialties include race and gender representation in popular culture, mixed race, African Americans and Afro-Brazilians, Black feminism, and race and sports. Her current book project, Imagining the Mulatta, Managing Blackness in U.S. and Brazilian Media, examines contemporary media representations of mixed Black women in the U.S. and Brazil. Her next project examines Brazilian mega sporting events and the role of race in public media culture. She has also published articles on race and gender in Brazilian hip hop and Brazilian cinema, and I am so thrilled to welcome Jasmine and appreciate her taking the time to guide us through this conversation.
Great.
Jasmine, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, George. And I'm already inspired by these fellows, and I'm ready to get further inspired with hearing more about their visions and implementations of social justice. So first, I would like to introduce Wan Sim. Wan Sim is a civic technologist and activist whose work centers immigrant rights and racial justice. Fueled by her passion for creating technology for communities that are overlooked by tech innovation, Wan co-founded FIRE, a multilingual mobile app that defends undocumented immigrants against unlawful enforcement tactics. By day, if that wasn't enough, she is a software engineer at Comcast. By night, she works with immigrant advocacy organizations, leads the FIRE volunteer team, and codes for the mobile app. Next up, with another exciting venture, we have Apefa Adjivon. And Apefa has worked with organizations in Toronto to develop multiple youth mentorship programs serving over 200 youth in the GTA. She serves as the co-chair for the Decade for People of African Descent to the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, and has brought her expertise on youth programming and engagement to various organizations, including the United Nations, Women's Health in Women's Hands, and Forbes. Outside of her passions for mentorship, programming, and advocacy, she works as innovation coordinator at Student Energy, supporting youth around the world in their work towards a sustainable energy future. And our final introduction for our fellow Whitley O'Connor, this is the Zoom world, is a social entrepreneur and supportive employment advocate. Whitley has launched multiple social enterprise programs, including an international award-winning magazine and a snow cone stand that employs transition-aged youth. Next month, he will open a social enterprise hub in Oklahoma City, including 2 new employment programs. And outside of work as a social entrepreneur, Whitley involves biking, golfing, and collecting and sending antique postcards. Great, thank you. Okay, So what I would like to do now is, if we can just actually start in order, and starting with Yuki Wan, if that's fine. I would love to hear your vision of social justice and how your venture helps implement part of that vision.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. I think my vision of social justice is people all doing their part to work together for a more equitable world. And for me, what that looked like is working from my community first. So I'm an immigrant, I am a DACA recipient, and I'm from Southern California. So I knew exactly intimately what the problems are in my own community, of folks who are not informed about their rights or the resources that they may have. So for me, it was really important to start locally and do what I can in my community first, instead of sometimes I fall back into being overwhelmed by the number of things that are wrong in the world. But I knew that the best way for me to tangibly make some action and change is through working with the place I know first.
Right, great. Thank you so much. And I love those reflections on using one's lived experiences and one's positionality, right, as assets. Right. Often those are thought of as disadvantages, right? But I love how you actually turn that into strengths, right? And I'm thinking about how we actually all have our own forms of knowledge, right? And how can we use those forms of knowledge, right, to serve within our own communities. Great, thank you. Next, Apefa, would you mind also answering that question about what your vision of social justice is, and how does your venture implement part of that vision?
Yeah, my vision for social justice would be a world where people are able to live out their lives as they see fit, without facing barriers, particularly around like race and gender, but also like class, immigration status. I could talk about this for a very long time. But my venture was called the Pearl Project, and it was a mentorship program for young women of color in the city of Toronto, focused on pairing them with a peer mentor and a professional mentor, to kind of give them that insight on navigating, I think, a bit of the emotional and personal bits of life, but also navigating getting to whatever career or professional goals that they had. And that venture turned into me creating a bunch of mentorship programs around that model, and really making sure that mentors not only looks like their mentees, but had some common lived experiences, because I do feel that mentorship is more impactful if the persons can speak to some of the barriers that you face. Um, yeah, so a big piece of my venture and the work that I do is getting young people, particularly young like BIPOC individuals, into I think the rooms that they want to be in, connect to the people that they want to be connected to, and creating resources and space for them to not only like shadow them and kind of see what whatever their passions look like, but to create impact, without having to kind of wait their turn or get a certain degree and things like that. Really instilling in them that you can do what you want to do now. And a lot of the barriers placed on you are not, they're real in terms of how they impact you, but they're not valid reasons as to why you're unqualified, and creating a room around that space.
Great, thank you. And I love how you brought up the intersectionality of race and gender and class and sexuality, and how that enters into our everyday lives, but also how those can enter into the structures, right, that often prevent people from being able to even access, right, those kinds of rooms, as well as the important of how representation matters, right? Of thinking about mentors and role models, and again, just as kind of Kiwan spoke to, right, of how those lived experiences, right, again, can be assets, right? Again, not as disadvantages, right? Not as a band-aid, but as something we should actually really celebrate and try to harness. Thank you. Whitley, can you also talk about your vision for social justice and how your venture implements part of that vision?
Sure. Yeah. Like the previous panel said, I kind of see it as this kind of equitable world where everyone has what they need and the resources they need to live, a dignified, fulfilling life. Kind of where I come into play is through supportive employment. So I really believe that everyone has value to contribute to society, and they deserve the dignity of meaningful employment. And so what we're trying to do is create a network of employment opportunities, kind of like you said. I came back to Oklahoma, where I'm from. I studied in Nashville, and I came back here because I know the problems that are happening in Oklahoma. I want to bring the social enterprise model and support employment models to Oklahoma. And so that's kind of what I'm working towards, is kind of this concept that, living wage, everyone has the opportunity to work, and everyone has skills that they can contribute if you're willing to work with them on some of these barriers to help them really shine.
Great, thank you. And I also appreciate how all of you talked about how you use your positionality, right? How you actually consider that, right, as part of your venture, and how you end up channeling that into practice. So I'd love to hear more about that from all of you, and just anyone can go, right, about how you actually engage, right, with the communities that you're working with. Right now, one of the buzzwords is it community engagement versus community service. So I'd love to hear more about how so many of you are working with your own communities, right? Communities, right, of areas or cities, right, where you grew up or where you're from, and how you use your positionality as well as the education and the tools that you've been given to engage. Anyone can jump in, or we can go in the order again. Maybe we can do we'll change it up, and we'll start with Apefa, if that's okay.
Yeah. I think for me, I mentioned that I work predominantly with BIPOC youth, but the majority of my programs actually cater to Black youth, and particularly young Black women, because I'm a young Black woman, and that is my experiences and my understanding of what the barriers are in terms of finding employment, in terms of kind of like following dreams and navigating institutional spaces, predominantly white spaces, come from the barriers that I face as a Black woman. And when I started out thinking about the mentorship program, it was because I didn't see many mentorship programs that had other Black women be mentors. And as someone who went through mentorship programs, it was really great. And I think the mentors are obviously like ready to help and well-intentioned, but there are certain conversations that I just could not have. And I think certain guidance that they could not provide because they didn't know what it was like to kind of walk in my skin. And so my work stems from that experience. And I do work predominantly with young Black women and Black youth, because that is like my understanding of being like a first generation immigrant and growing up in Canada, and not necessarily having parents that can speak to a lot of the spaces that I'm navigating within. And I think my understanding of community engagement is that if you do not personally identify with the problem that you're trying to fix, or if people on your team don't personally identify with the problem that you're trying to fix, I don't know that I can say that you're doing community engagement. Community work cannot be done without members of a community involved, nothing for us without us. And so I think that's the split. Community service to me is very much centered in kind of seeing another group and wanting to help. And I think that's very well-intentioned, and community service is important. But there is a bit of a duty, a large duty to consult, and a large duty to make sure you're in conversation with the either geographic area or a community that you're hoping to help, and also not overgeneralizing. I say I work with Black young women, but I think the specific answer is that I work with Black young women in the Greater Toronto area. There's a lot of different barriers that people are facing, and I think a lot of them are common, but there are specific barriers to the regional area that I work within, and specific barriers to being in Western versus Eastern Canada. And a big piece of community engagement is understanding where your place is within that issue or within that community. And if you can't speak to that experience, or haven't lived it, or don't have people on your team who can speak personally, you're not supporting them in that space, maybe taking a step back and looking at what's already been done in that community and seeing how you can use your own resources, connections to support that work as well.
Great, thank you. Again, speaking about how that representation, right, does matter and does speak to people. Right? I officially made associate professor yesterday, right? And I've had so many students, right, talk to me. You're the first Black professor I've ever had, right? And then on top of that, you're the first Black female professor, right, I've ever had or actually even seen, right? And but that could really change the whole vision, right? But I love of also how you talk about if you don't occupy one of those roles, right? How do you also know, right, what step to take, right? Of when to lean back, of when to listen, and how to engage. Yeah, really important knowledge you're sharing. Thank you. We'll just go kind of the reverse, lip back. Can we go to Whitley or anyone else want to chime in?
Yeah, so I think that's a good transition, right? I'm a young white guy in America, so I do have a lot of duty with that, right? I've been able to watch every single president look a lot like me until the last, right? And so, there's no space that I couldn't enter, right? There's no space I couldn't look to for role models. And so that's very great for me, really unfortunate for many, many, many other people, more than half the population, obviously. And so, like Apefa said, I really take that seriously. Saul Alinsky talks a lot about leadership styles. I'm not a native leader. I work predominantly with individuals experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness. I have not experienced that myself. I work, the majority of the folks I work with are minority populations. I obviously don't have experience myself with that. And so it does take a lot of listening. It takes a lot of engagement with the community. Our work is really informed by what our population wants, right? Our magazine is, the magazine we run is sold by and partly produced by individuals experiencing homelessness. And so they inform our content, they inform the direction we head. And it's really important that I listen to that, as well as I do my best to elevate others, right, and help cultivate others in that space. The social enterprise space is still very much growing in Oklahoma. It's small, and I'm excited to see more things pop up. But in particular, I'm really excited to see things happening in communities not like mine. And honestly, I need to be more engaged in those areas because, again, I do have a responsibility. And sometimes I like to say, we had white guys had a really great run for thousands of years, but now it's our turn to kind of step back and see what we can do to create a more equitable system for everyone.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that reflection on how important it is to listen, right? But of also have people in those communities, right, inform and be part of those decisions, right? Rather than having decisions made for them, right? That's a much more kind of like traditional paternalistic fashion, right? And this really changes the tables. And I'm just echoing here some of the similarities as I see that you and Apefa are really talking about this in terms of duty and responsibility, right? So I want you to keep that tuned in because I'd love to hear more about that idea of duty and responsibility to social justice. All right, but Giwan, I'd love to hear your voice too on these same questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Everyone, I can echo what everyone else has already said in terms of engagement and service. I think the work that I do on a day-to-day, being in tech, being in big tech at that, I see a lot of patterns where young people who enter tech will often have this tech savior mentality, intentionally or not, where if you see systems that are broken, well, like here's a tech band-aid, like we can fix that. And that often leads to service in a way that is like just creating more band-aid solutions. So for me, as I'm doing this work, even though I am in the affected population and I am a part of the undocumented immigrant community, I'm hyper conscious and I try to be very intentional about when I think tech is an appropriate solution and when it isn't. And that also takes into account my positionality. So I remember before I applied for the Resolution Fellowship and I had the idea of making this comprehensive app for Know Your Rights information, realizing that raids were happening in LA and my parents didn't know their rights and I had to coach them on FaceTime on like, what do you do when the agent is at the door? And I had to be their translator essentially because they couldn't find this information themselves online. And that's I had like a very good reason why I came up with this idea. But when I went to nonprofits and kind of cold emailed them and pitched this to them, I suddenly became very conscious of, oh, you don't really see Asian Americans as undocumented people represented in the media. And that's done very intentionally, right? To create divisions and rifts in our own community. You don't see undocumented Black people. It's very much painted like as a monolith of just like bad hombres or just like people coming from Mexico. And that's really harmful to our own community, because for me, I almost feel like I had to justify my reasons for helping my own community. And like, I also want to do my part as an Asian person in this community. But yeah, I remember there was some like apprehension from nonprofits that I would cold email. And I also had to, recognize that I have DACA that grants me a lot of privilege. I'm not a laborer like my parents are. And that also goes to like thinking about the duty aspect that Apefa and Whitley talked about. I think I have the emotional bandwidth to have that duty to my community, and with the education that I've had and the privileged, I somehow got a golden ticket into American meritocracy, and I have the bandwidth to be able to do this work. But if my parents or people who are day laborers want to disengage, absolutely, I think that's absolutely okay. So yeah.
Great. Oh, thank you for really delving into that complexity rate of duty and when to take on certain duties, but also when duties might be just taking care of oneself, right? Or the duty might be listening, or there are different forms, right, of engaging. That might be starting a venture, right? Or might be being a kind person, right? It might be doing more than, clicking a like. It might be, writing, I just published my book, right? Just came out in May, finally happened, right? It might be publishing a book, or it might be teaching, right? It might be talking with others, right, about why that media representation that you're talking about matters, right? Trying to dispel some of those bad hombre, right, myths, or Blacks as naturally deviant and criminal. So you talked about this Band-Aid, and that was actually going to be one of my other questions, right? That I would love to hear about how do we get from this Band-Aid kind of savior model to actually getting to a cycle of liberation. Okay, so I'd love to then hear, well, why don't I actually start now with Apefa, Hen. Actually, you know what, we'll do the reverse. Sorry, we'll start now with Whitley. And we can just get to, how is your venture, or how do you see a cycle of liberation potentially happening?
Yeah, so our goal is really to help people kind of create a network. What we're trying to do is create a network that leads from experiencing homelessness back into what we might call like the mainstream or traditional workforce, right? And that looks like a lot of different things, but kind of talking about Band-Aids, we've seen a lot of failed attempts at that, right? It's difficult, right? It's long-term. It's not, you put someone in a 6-week program and now they're ready to go to work at a tech company or something. There's a lot of money being poured into that, and that's really great, but we work with folks with significantly higher barriers than a lot of these programs that have come out. And so, what we're trying to do is create this long-term sustaining impact, right? By walking alongside people through this journey, right? And it's, a lot of people ask us, well, how long can someone work for you? And we don't have a limit, right? It's however long they need to in order to be successful, right? Because what we've really realized working in the homeless community really is that this one size fits all approach doesn't work, right? It leads to really poor outcomes. And so what we work to do is create self-sufficiency. And when that is created, that's when kind of someone's ready to exit from our program. And so that's kind of what we do, is we're really trying to create that network that allows people to get back on their feet, starting with housing, because we fundamentally believe that housing is a right and it's the first step. We believe in the housing first model. And then from there, address these other barriers that's going to lead to this long-standing ability to be self-sufficient and self-realized, and, kind of that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, kind of work your way up. And so we're really trying to address those bottom rungs so that then they can go on and kind of realize the fulfillment that we kind of hope for in this, more just future, right?
Great. Thank you. Sorry, my kid running in here. So actually, Apefa, I'd love to go to you and talking about this cycle of liberation. And I love what Whitley said about sustainable impact.
A lot of the work that I do, because it's mentorship models or like youth boards, things like that, inclusion models, relies heavily on the idea of representation. And I think as we think about like the Black Lives Matter movement and what we're seeing happening in like North America right now, and how people are trying to show their support and help, quite a few people are mistaking representation for liberation. They're not the same thing. And there's, in my opinion, quite a few kind of band-aid solutions coming out in this moment surrounding the Black community, and I think supporting and helping the Black community. And so something that I communicate to a lot of the organizations that are approaching me now to create mentorship teams, to kind of introduce Black youth to their organizations, is that if you're simply kind of making the seat at the table is not enough, you have to make sure that like the table is set, you have to make sure there's food at the table, make sure all the guests are present. Like there's a lot of back work that needs to be done to make sure that the project that you're working on is sustainable and creates that cycle of liberation that you're talking about. So for me, in context of mentorship program, the cycle of liberation looks like the mentee receives their mentor, but they also both mentee and mentor receives support. So there's workshops for both. There's capacity building for both. There's professional workshop for the mentee, but also self-care workshop for the mentee. I've done programs where the mentors have access to therapists and like mental health supports, because it can be working from a place of lived experience, can be a lot of emotional labor. And you never know what your mentee is going to throw at you. So creating that kind of emotional support for the mentor, but also not just leaving the mentor to be that only source representation. So hosting events for them all to meet each other, creating spaces for them to hear other mentors speak and hear inspiring stories, and Zoom with other people from different countries. It's representation models and programs that run on representation aren't just what you see. I think it's just the easiest way for me the easiest way to explain impact is in what you see, because we all know what it's like, or not we all know, but most of the people that I work with know what it's like to look on TV and not see someone that looks like you, or to go into an office and not see any coworkers that look like you. And it's not an empowering experience. It's a lonely one. And so the terms of representation and this idea of like creating space for youth is a very easy way to communicate change, but it's also a band-aid way to communicate change. And a big piece of creating cycles of liberation is making sure that you're thinking about how the impact lasts long term. So whether that's the mentee getting a position in their mentor's organization, or if that's that mentee being able to walk away having done a bunch of workshops on interview skills, professional development, how to network, how to apply for grants if they have their own social venture. When working with other organizations, communicating to them that maybe they need some equity training or some racial sensitivity training, and they need to compensate youth to make sure that youth are able to participate in this board and still have their own priorities and do so from, I think, a stable and good place in their lives. So that was a very long-winded answer. But the cycle of liberation is not simply thinking of the idea and putting it in place. It's working backwards and thinking about how the participants are going to take that learning or take that experience long-term.
Great. No, thank you so much for that answer. And especially thinking about how visibility does not always equal power. Right? Can we go to Giwan now?
Yeah, sure thing. For me, I think in doing my venture, how I try to avoid being a band-aid solution in my community is fitting my work into models that already exist on the ground for nonprofits. And I think this kind of goes against the grain of what traditionally tech tries to do, which is to try to disrupt all workflows. And the idea for them is, like disrupt and then you can fix the problems later. But I think when my issue is working with systemic inequalities and systemic racism. So I have to work with the systems that already exist to support people on the ground. And something incredible that I've found is that there are mutual aid networks and like grassroots organizers that try to protect their own communities in forms of rapid response networks. And that is, I think, the system I found to try to amplify them and their work by putting by consolidating all of their work into the app that I have, and trying to get them as visible as possible to the people that could actually use them. For me, I think actually having the conversations with the folks who are already doing the work is a way that I'm trying to be a more long-term sustainable solution for my own community. And another piece, at least for the immigrant community, is it is important for us to engage allies and meaningfully engage allies into doing actions and protests, because we are disenfranchised from having a voice aside from getting as many people as possible to call their representatives and actually try to pass a comprehensive immigration reform in Congress. So for us, like, we can do that work, but through the app, I'm talking to nonprofits to try to see, you know, what do you think is the most effective way to engage folks for actionable pieces that we don't always want to put the burden on just our own community for. So yeah, that's what I am trying to do, to move towards cycles of liberation and not just be a Band-Aid solution.
Yeah, thank you for these remarks. So I'd also love to hear, some of you kind of alluded to this amplification of voices, as well as trying to build coalitions and create solidarity. So I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on that, right? Of how to start building these coalitions, how to amplify other voices that might not be your own, right? Personally, you might come from those communities even, but might not actually be your own voice. And how do you build solidarity? So anyone can jump in. We can actually go back to you, Wan, if you'd like.
Yeah, I actually came across an interesting and unexpected challenge around solidarity and building coalitions in my own work. The LA immigrant community is incredibly diverse. There are mostly Spanish-speaking immigrants, but also a really large number of Chinese, Korean, Filipino immigrants as well. And when I started working with my the nonprofit partner that I currently have, Chirla, and they predominantly work with Spanish-speaking folks, we asked them, you know, like, hey, like, do you have connections to like the two large Asian American organizations that exist? And they were like, no, we don't know anyone there, which was really telling to me, because these are the two organizations that were appointed by the city, like the state of California, to give COVID relief funding to undocumented immigrants. So they're recognized statewide, but they don't talk to each other, which to me was alarming. And also I was like, I'm a newcomer into this space, but I try to ask them and nudge to have them actually reach out and make connections so that we can all try to collaborate on a solution and get Asian Americans advancing justice to try to also be a part of the venture. But first, I think the important piece about coalition building is there might not be bridges where you expected them to be, was one of the lessons I learned. I also had to try to understand the historical context for why those connections don't currently exist. And that's something that I am working on every time I work with my nonprofit partners. But yeah.
Great, thank you so much. And actually, speaking of talking with each other and learning from each other, I would actually love to take this time now for Apefa and for Whitley, for you to also engage with right, these questions of how do we build, solidarity and talk with each other, even if it's right now, right, what we're doing exactly at this moment, in this kind of Zoom, Facebook, YouTube world. Why don't we start with Apefa?
Sorry, I'm thinking. That's a tough one. How to build solidarity and talk with each other. I think a big piece of speaking, especially right now, is listening. And so I think it's a knee jerk and I think gut reaction to immediately want to say something about what's going on right now. And I think to immediately want to be part of the conversation. I would say that if you're not as familiar with some of the issues that people are talking about in current events and things like that, to take a minute to listen to what people with lived experience, people who are experts are saying, whether that's, I'm not a big fan of like TV news, so I would suggest social media. There's a lot of great people who are speaking out on Twitter. There's amazing organizations on Instagram, YouTube, but also like local organizations that are organizing. They are having protests. They're sending out zines. Like there are a lot of non-traditional spaces for education. And I think recognizing that not every single person who is informed is someone that necessarily has like a wide-reaching and huge platform. The majority of the times, the people that are going to be the most honest about what is happening and what the real impacts aren't the people who have the largest platform ever. And so in terms of building solidarity, and I think a big piece of recognizing your privilege and amplifying other voices is if you are someone that has that access to a larger platform, that access to greater networks or organizations to support someone's work, and you hear about someone, definitely contact them, and rather than maybe trying to add on to their work or tangibly contribute to their work, because they might have a lot of things already going on, I think just providing a space for them to discuss that and get the message out is a really impactful way to provide support. And also acknowledging that you're not an expert and you don't have to be an expert. You don't have to have all your ducks in a row on every single subject ever. And just taking that time to kind of sit back and read and listen and learn is a big piece in starting that discussion and making sure that as you're learning, you're sharing it with those around you is also hugely important.
Great, yeah, thank you. On Whitley, and especially on thinking about how we can use these platforms.
Yeah, so obviously we have a platform, we run a magazine, so we literally have a platform to share. That's why it's really important that our work is informed by the individuals we work with, right? And that's why we, a lot of people expect that it's actually kind of the reverse, right? Our articles about social issues are typically informed by people with lived experience, where a lot of our articles about like general interest are written by individuals with lived experience with homelessness, right? And it's kind of to share this idea of, someone who's experiencing homelessness, their only topic of expertise isn't camping, right? Or living under a bridge or being in a shelter. They may know a lot about the Oklahoma City Thunder. They may know a ton about brewing beer, whatever, right? Like they have things that they can share beyond that, right? And so we definitely like to highlight that with our magazine, right? In addition, I say we really try to take a pretty even keel approach, pretty moderate approach to everything, and try to be as unbiased as possible, because we want to reach as broad of an audience, right? We don't want to alienate people. And we've really kind of taken that approach since the beginning and found that we have really been able to push people towards what our positions would be through kind of a very, unbiased, here's the story. We're not pushing policy or whatever down your throat, but we end up seeing that people actually move towards a policy we would like to see, because they see people who are experiencing that and they don't see us saying, vote for a Democrat or vote for whoever, right? They see us saying, here's an issue, here are some solutions, right? And so that's where I see us really kind of using that as really trying to, slowly nudge people through information and through sharing experiences and showing them, people often think that the folks we work with who experience homelessness, they must all be Democrats, right? But they're really, it's incredibly foolish to think that an entire population thinks one way, right? We have all kinds of spectrum. I mean, people are people, right? And so we just want to portray that as best as possible and help. That's kind of how the platform we have, and that's a platform we use to try our best to move the needle where we can.
I'd like to just end with some positivity and simple affirmation. So I would love just to end with, if each of you can just come up with one word that encapsulates your vision for 2020 and beyond. I know, an easy task, right? On being concise. So just one word, just to end our session with. And why don't we actually start with you, Whitley?
Oh man, I say my word is opportunity. And to go beyond that very briefly, I think we have a huge opportunity here. There have been a lot of systems, obviously, have been completely disrupted. A lot of things have been broken, and we have an opportunity to rebuild and to do it better, right? I think we have to take that opportunity, and we have to see the inequality for what it is. It's been very glaringly apparent in 2020. There have been a lot of incredible movements, and we have the opportunity to build something really incredible and improve on what is a very flawed system.
Great, thank you so much. Kiwan, one word.
I'm going to cheat and I'm going to say show up with a hyphen. I think that in this moment, there is everything someone can do, anything anyone can do to show up and share your vision for justice. And for me, it's working on my venture, but for someone else, it could be going to a protest. And I think action is what matters in this moment.
Great, thank you. Apefa, one word.
I think my word would be reimagine. I think if there's one thing 2020 has shown us, it's that just because things have always gone a certain way does not mean they have to continue to go that way, and that we shouldn't be afraid to rethink everything and push for those changes and advocate for them as well.
Great, thank you. I think that's a great way to start to wrap up our panel. I want to turn it over to George, but first off, I just want to thank all of you for sharing your knowledge.
Wow, thank you so much, Jasmine, for guiding us through this important conversation and doing it in such a deft way. Really grateful for you and for bringing us so many insights in such a short period of time. Once again, I do want to thank our sponsor, White & Case, for helping make this event possible. And Apefa, Giwan, and Whitley, the work you're all doing shows the importance of making sure there are community-led solutions to so many of the social justice issues we see in the world today. But it also underscores something we believe here at Resolution, which is that social justice and equity aren't issues like clean water or education. They're at the center of all of the issues we're facing. As an organization, we look forward to providing other Resolution Fellows with the resources, funding, and support to follow your leadership in making the world a more equitable place. I just want to thank you for all that you do, for all of the people you inspire, including all of us right now, and to just thank you for your leadership as we try to shape a more equitable and just world, as we reimagine it, as we take this opportunity, and as we show up. I also want to thank all of you who joined us this evening. With the world in crisis, we appreciate your support in helping build the next generation of young leaders. There's a link that's being shared in the live chat right now, and through that you can help support these future Resolution Fellows. You can also visit resolutionproject.org and donate through the button on the top right-hand corner. Now, more than ever, we look towards the next generation of leaders, and your support this evening can help get them started. So thank you all again for attending. Please, please, please join us tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. for our interactive Can't Miss main event. You'll have the opportunity to network with other event attendees one-on-one, hear from fellows in a small group discussion, and enjoy a live musical performance by Ryan Leslie. RSVP information can be found on our website or in the chat to the right. Thank you again so much, and have a wonderful evening.